Welcome back. I'm glad you're here because we're almost at that final step in the quilt making process, what we call quilt as desired. Stay with us. I have a lot of interesting things to show you about that final step, that big bad word called the binding. Welcome back. I'm Hollis Turnbow to talk about bindings today. That final project that we either love or really hate, but a very integral and important part of the full quilt making process, because the binding can be good, it can be bad, it can be awkward or whatever. This is like the frame that you put around the quilt. I want to talk to you about that today. A lot of hints, a lot of suggestions that you might have. Now you'll notice I don't have a sewing machine set up because you can sew, but I thought what you need to know are those things that I've learned in the struggle to do good bindings. All those hints that will make a good binding, so we don't need to show you how to sew the sewing machine. I just need to tell you the steps that you go through and the things you need to think about. Invariably, a quilt maker will at some point say, how wide should I cut my binding? Well, it depends on what the quilt is and how wide it's ultimately going to be. The other thing that they would ask is, what should I use for my binding? Should I use a bias? Should I use a straight? So I want to talk a little bit about that. In a lot of quilts I make, they're very simple, not decorative at all. They're quilts that go to charity. And what I try to do is, even though they're very simple, I put some kind of an interesting type of binding on them to add that little bit of special, which takes no time at all. And very often, the very ugliest kind of fabric, or the fabric that you might assume could never be used, make the most interesting bindings. I love to go to a fabric shop, and usually you can find it down south, not much up north. And in the warehouses and mill-in shops, you'll find fabric that is misprinted. I love to find these because what happens, they make absolutely wonderful bindings. Almost looks custom or high-fashion bindings. Very easy to do. It adds that little bit of extra touch. So don't overlook anything that might be what you would consider otherwise not useful. Here's another piece that I found, which was obviously on the end of a printing bolt. This is a panel print of an underwater scene, but look what it would do in the binding. Adds a very decorative touch, and then of course I do love to use stripes with it. But then just plain fabrics work fine. I like to use them. They can be coordinated with the top and back, like this green here on the green quilt. Just very plain, very plain. What I like to do is to work and do the initial sewing on the sewing machine and then sit at night and do the final stitching toward the back by hand. There's a lot of satisfaction for me in that. Some quilters want to do both sides on the sewing machine, which is perfectly acceptable. But the thing about bindings that we should all remember is I've posted on the poster over here to the left, on the left table. Good bindings are even width. They should be full, which means the batting and the top and back should fill the binding well. They should be neatly mitered. That's the corner that we have on here, neatly mitered. They should be small, even stitches when you stitch the batting down, or stitch the binding down. And here's an example that I did, which will show you that. Very long stitches here came up to very short, small stitches here. I deliberately did it in a contrasting thread so you'd be able to see it. So invisible small stitches Also close together, because we don't want any toe tuggers in here, that a toenail might rip the binding out. And then, of course, the last element that I wrote there is fussy cut evenly. That simply means that if you're using a pattern fabric, as I have here, then cut on the pattern rather than just simply rip at the width or the length of the fabric. Even though it's slightly on, not on true grain, it will still work. Here's a good example of that, and I've already showed you the other quilt. It was very difficult to do to keep this particular square even on the side. Here's another one. This was left from another quilt. Makes an excellent binding, and then the plain ones here. So look at the binding as an integral part and a very interesting decorative part of your entire quilt. So what we want is nice even corners, nice even bindings on the quilt, as I've said on the chart. These are the things that the judge will look for if you're entering your quilt in a quilt show. But even before that, if you're not even considering having your quilt judged, it does make for a better looking quilt if the bindings are nicely mitered, corners even and precise. I mentioned that very often quilt makers will say, how wide should I cut my binding? Most books, many books, how can I say this? You know, I don't want to cover the whole world in books. Our patterns will say cut your binding 2.5 inches wide. That's probably a standard. Other folks would come back and say, I cut mine 2 1/4. Somebody else will come back and I do 3 inches. So again, the width that you cut your binding depends a lot on your personal preference. But there's some things I've discovered about binding. Remember I said the binding should be full, which means there's a direct relationship to your seam allowance and the width of your binding that you're going to be cutting. A general guideline on cutting the width of your fabric is 6 times the width of what your seam allowance is going to be. Which means if you have a 1/2 inch seam allowance, then 6 times that is going to be 2.5 inches. Is that correct? If it's not, you know, bear with me, just say 6 times. My mind is not mathematically plugged in today. But anyway, it should be 6 times the width of whatever your seam allowance is going to be. If your seam allowance is going to be 1 inch, then 6 times that, you should cut it 6 inches, which I have done in, no, this looks like about 3 inches here, but I have done it all the way up to 6 inches wide. Here it is. Here's the example right here. I'm going to make a very wide binding on this, what looks like a placemat. So I wanted an inch binding, so I cut the binding 6 inches, and I'll come back to this a little bit later. So use that as a guide to start with. The next step then is that when you actually apply that binding, even though I'm saying that I want it to be 1 inch, my seam allowance 1 inch, which is going to give me a nice border on this placemat. So I've chosen the width a little bit according to the use of the piece that we'll have. So I want a nice wide binding on here because to me this looks like a placemat. Now, what you need to consider when you fold your binding, and the 6 inches would be folded down to 3, so I have 3 inches here. Logically and technically, if we use pure thing, then your seam allowance should be 1 inch and you should have 2 inches left. However, and there are a lot of howevers in this, you must take into consideration the amount of space that's taken up when you fold it. You have 2 layers here, and when you fold it to the back, you have that space that's taken up by the batting and the 2 layers here. So if I turn this over to the back, my logic tells me I should have 1 inch back there. But look what happens. See, here's my seam. Here it is. So now I know that that 1 inch is not going to be correct in order to allow me to pull this to the back, because I want this fold to hit this seam line right here. So I need to go back then and adjust the width of this. And you adjust it accordingly, incrementally. And what I do sometime is I'll come back and I'll put pins in here down at a point in which I can fold it and fold it to the back. So let me do this again, because I know some of you are going to write and say, really, what did he mean? I couldn't see it. In my example here, I have used a 1 inch seam allowance. Remember, this was cut 6 inches, folded, so I have 3 inches in the binding here, because this is a placemat, so I wanted the binding to be wider. Now, remember, this is out of the norm. Normally the binding comes out at a 1/4 inch or whatever. So this is out of the norm. But I'm using this as an example because it's easier to see and the concepts are certainly the same. So now I stitched my binding 1 inch, so I have a 1 inch seam allowance in here. So according to my mathematical formula, I should have 2 inches in here, which I do. Right here, 2 inches here. Now logic tells me that when I fold this to the back now, it would meet the seam line here. However, remember in basic patchwork we talk about scant 1/4 inch, and we use a scant 1/4 inch in our seam allowance rather than a 1/4 inch to take into consideration the space that's taken in the fold of the fabric. It's just as important in this that we do that. So let me turn this now to the back. Here it is. I would turn it to the back. Hopefully that edge is going to match the seam. And I will fold it here. Nice wide binding on the top would make a nice placemat. But look what happens on the back. It does not fit. It comes almost 1/2 inch from meeting that. Remember that scant 1/4 inch? I have heavy fabric. I have a fold here on the top which takes up space. It's not pressing down as well as I would like it to. You have a fold here. So I need to compensate for that. So I would go back then and start adjusting this seam allowance to accommodate that. And I adjust by taking a piece of fabric, ripping my seam out there because I've tested it, and I'll go back and I'll pin it at the top, fold that back, and now I'm touching. See, I have no idea at this point how wide that seam allowance is, but I know it's accurate. So I would take that onto my sewing machine. Here's the line, and I might go back and dot this with a chalk pencil so I know where the line is. Adjust the presser foot size, and that's what the distance is going to be. That's what the measurement of the seam allowance is going to be. I don't care what it is. I'm not controlled by the edge of a quilt that allows me only to do a 1/4 inch binding. I have a lot of space in here, and I'm still going to have a nice wide binding for the placemat. Let me go back through all of that again. The norm is 2.5 inches, which then tells you or allows you to have about a 1/4 inch seam allowance, maybe 3/8 inch seam allowance, but make sure that the seam allowance is the right width so it's going to fold over into the back correctly and meet where you want it to meet and meet that seam. If it doesn't, then go back and adjust your seam allowance. It doesn't make any difference what it is. There's absolutely no rules that says the seam allowance must be this, that, and the other, because what we're striving for is what I have on the poster, even width, and it's full. So that's what our concern is rather than the fact it's X amount of inches. Okay, you've now determined the size or your width of your binding that you're cut, width of the seam allowance. So we start stitching now. I discovered in doing my crib quilts, which I showed you on the sports quilt earlier, that using a 2.5 inch binding and a 3/8 inch seam allowance was a little bit large or small for it to wrap around neatly. So I've cut my bindings down to 2¼ inches with a 3/8 seam allowance, and it folds over nicely and just matches the seam allowance. So after you've done that and you started sewing, the next thing will be the neatly mitered corners, as the chart says. I discovered a little trick some time ago that helps me to do that and be able to make a consistent seam like it down. Now the other part, as I said, showed on the chart, is even width, so that's very important. I discovered a problem that I was having, and I believe a lot of quilt makers do, and this happens in my classes, is we tend to lose control about the last 1/2 inch of any seam. I think we assume that the machine is going to know exactly where to go, but it'll go where it wants to. It won't go where I want to. Also, wherever you're sitting and the way you're sitting may control the way that you are sending the fabric under the machine. So maintain control so that you'll maintain consistency all the way down to the end. The next thing is a neatly mitered corner. I read the books and the patterns, and everyone said, remember they were assuming a 1/4 inch seam allowance here, is stitched down to a 1/4 inch to the end of your piece. Now my seam allowance is 3/8 inches, so I need to stitch down to 3/8 inch from the end of my quilt in order to stop. So I bought all kinds of things. I cut 3x5 cards and angles and so forth because I never could decide exactly where that 3/8 inch stopped. So one day I was sitting at my machine and I accidentally folded the fabric back, right up, back, totally different than what I normally did. And I held a pin right down in the corner and I folded the binding this way. So what I'm doing is I'm mitering on the top rather than as you normally would with doing the mitered corner. And it hit me just like a thunderbolt. This fold right here, when my stitching comes to the fold, I'm exactly the same distance from there to the end as the seam allowance is, or seam is. So I no longer had to measure. Then I remembered the fold and the space that folds take up here, and I've got a lot of fold coming down into the corner that has to be folded back into that miter. So I started stopping about 2 stitches before I got to the fold. And that allows enough space then for the miter to fold neatly on the top. And it's the top that we're concerned about here. Now, that was done only as a guide. I've had some students that did every corner this way. And you can't miter it then, so a lot of ripping had to go through. I was about ready to have a class in creative ripping because in quilt making we do a lot of ripping. So anyway, this fold is simply to tell me where to stop. After that, and all of the instructions will explain this to you, we go back then, fold it up away from the piece like this. Now to get a good, consistent, even mitered corner, it is absolutely important that this fold be on a 90-degree angle from here. If you need to get a 3x5 card or something out, do it, because if it comes in this way or comes in this way, then you're going to have problems when you try to do the corner. So make sure that this is absolutely straight here, and hopefully my eyes will tell me that. And then you take this and you fold it back down into the area where you will be stitching. Now the other thing to watch for is when you fold it back down, here to do the miter, make sure that your underline fold is exactly on the edge of your top. This is another indication that you're going to have a good, nice miter here. Then start here at the top, making sure that you have a correct seam allowance coming down, and continue. Now what I've learned is that if I will put the sewing machine needle in just inside the fold like this, that holds all the layers together while I get this adjusted correctly to go down. Also, you don't have the problem of the pressure foot pushing against it and causing a hump on the end. So with your hand, put the needle in right at that point, and that will hold all these layers together. Okay, we're going down. We do the same thing here. We do the same thing here. And we get to the end. And let me talk about the end now. Very interesting. There are a lot of techniques and instructions about how to join the ends of your quilt. I like to do a mitered joining here. Some instructions will say take the first layer, fold it over, and slip the other piece in. Some will do, the one thing that I hope you don't do though is just do a straight cut, because that's offensive to the eye. An angle cut here, when you join it, your eye will hardly see it because your eye will flow. So try to avoid a straight cut here and make it on a mitered or on the diagonal. So we come around into this point. You lay one piece over the other. Right here is where I started quilting. And when you start putting the binding on, come down about 6 or 8 inches to start, so that you have this tail loose here, right here. Then this piece comes fold over, and it may stretch all the way down here, whatever's simply left. So you have excess. But when you start, I always start on one side because that's the easiest for me. So you start stitching about 6 or 8 inches down, leave this over, go all around, miter your corners. You come back, and here's this long tail hanging up. You know, it could be 6 or 7 inches. So you lay it over your previous one. Now, one thing I like to remember and to remind quilters is be sure and cut the selvage off this piece, because I cut the bindings on the width of the fabric, so there's a selvage on that end. So cut this off so you don't have the selvage, for 2 reasons. Or the basic reason is because that's going to add more bulk into it, you know. But cut the selvage off. So lay this over the other one and measure down from where the bottom one comes to the end of this long piece, the width of your binding. Now, I used to scramble for rulers and whatever, but right there is the width of your binding. So I measured down the width of the binding, put a mark, and I cut it off. So you need an overlap, which is the width of whatever your binding might be. Now, I was sitting at my machine one day, and if you're not careful the way that you pick this up and stitch it together, you can get these twisted. So I was doing all kinds of things to remind me how to do it. So you take these 2 ends now, you layer them up, and you put your thumbs in the inside like this. You put your thumbs on the inside. And then you take this and turn it around and line it up with your left side. Now let me say this another way. You know, as children, we think of little sayings to help us remind us of certain things that we should do or remember or whatever. Think about this as the soldier method, the standing soldier method of doing your bindings. Here they are, standing up straight. One turns to the other and watches him do push-ups. So this one turns to the other, looks at him, and there it is right there. So I want to line these two pieces up like this. So I have a V here. And then with the sewing machine, I will start sewing from the left to the right. Left to the right. And let me pin this because I don't have a sewing machine. I'll pin it as though I were sewing it down. So here I am. Now, if you were not comfortable with doing that, and let me pull this out straight so that you can see it, you might take a ruler and mark your seam line down, like so, like this. Then the first thing you do is open this up to make sure that you have not twisted this. See there? I have not twisted it. I can see this, that it's going to fall in straight. Then you go back and you stitch along that line, and then you can cut this little triangle off. And your binding then will be perfectly closed, perfectly matched. Remember the soldiers turning that way. Your thumbs in the inside on the wrong side, turning to the left. Try it a little bit. Work about it until your hands feel that movement, and then you'll be able to do it. Then it fits perfectly. One little caution I might say, though, if sometime your seam was not accurate, it was a little bit shorter or longer than you want, it doesn't come together exact, maybe the edge has stretched, and you find sometime that you have a little bit of excess fabric coming here where it comes to the end, as I have here. If that excess is not too great, then you can take a stiletto and you can push down a little bit on the top, and that will work your excess out. If the excess, however, is too much, then the only thing to do is rip out some here, rip out some here, and change your seam here so that it will indeed fit. Bindings, they're important. Important that we have good bindings. Even though it might be our common quilt that we live with every day, or might be show quilt. Very easy to accomplish, very important to the overall look of the quilt. Even width, full, which means there's a consistent seam allowance. Neatly mitered corners. Have a little example right here of corners not neatly mitered. What is the problem? Remember I said if that fold was not exactly perpendicular or 90 degree that you'll have problem? That was the problem here. Look how it rabbit ears out. Another thing I want to say about your bindings, and I mentioned this earlier when I showed decorative fabric or pattern fabric, make sure that you do cut it. Here's an example. Here's one that I just simply cut the fabric just with a ruler across the fabric. But look how difficult it is. Almost looks like a candy stripe. It doesn't do. As opposed to being very particular and making it match even. Much more attractive here than the other one there. So make sure that they're neat. A little bit of practice. If you're having difficulty on them, rip it out. Find out what the problem was so that you'll know how to correct it next time. I think this probably brings us to the bottom step in our journey downward toward quilt as desired. I've enjoyed talking to you. I hope you'll watch again and again and again, because I think in each one of the episodes there's underlying meanings, there are underlying information that will be helpful for you. Glad you came, glad you watched. I'm Hollis Turnbow at the bottom step on Quilt as Desired.